a man kills his wife and children, makes a phone call claiming he messed up, and then turns the gun on himself. We have an expert to talk about why people kill their entire families. Welcome back to Sidebar on Law and Crime. I'm Angenette Levy. Cassandra Flores was a 29-year-old mother to 3 children, Hillary, Damaris, and Matthias Armendariz. A family member found Flores, her children, and her estranged husband, Ruben Armendariz, shot to death at their home in Oklahoma City last Wednesday night. Ruben Armendariz and one of the children were taken to the hospital where they later died. Shockingly, Cassandra Flores' brother told a TV station that Ruben Armendariz called his father and said, "I messed up." Cassandra Flores' father returned home and found the terrible scene: his daughter, grandchildren, and estranged son-in-law all dead. A GoFundMe page has been set up to pay for the funerals. The page's organizers said Cassandra was a loving mother, friend, and daughter, and she was working hard to give her 3 children a good life. Joining me to discuss this incredibly disturbing case is Dr. N.G. Berrill. He is a forensic psychologist. Dr. Berrill, welcome to Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
When you read about this story, this awful story about this man, Ruben Armendariz, taking the lives of his children, his estranged wife, and then himself, what comes to mind as far as your forensic psychology background goes?
Well, these kinds of incidents do occur regularly around the country. And basically, there's usually some common factors or ingredients that contribute to this kind of behavior.
And what are those common factors and ingredients?
Well, look, if you have a marriage that's fallen apart, you have an estranged husband, um, the one issue to ask is from his perspective, was there a history of, number one, substance abuse, meaning alcohol or drugs? Number two, was there a history of psychiatric illness? Or 3, was his response to the breakup of this marriage and family, for him, emotionally speaking, kind of a catastrophe that he was unable to digest, work through, get around, or whatever. So in essence, you have a very unhappy, disturbed individual who feels that no doubt he's lost everything. And he's now shut out from a family that he was formerly a part of. He was the husband and father. And now he's on his own and more or less, isolated from a lifestyle and perhaps equally important, an identity that he probably cherished. And that was the identity of spouse and father and so on. And now that's gone.
The one thing that I find even more disturbing about this, aside from the fact that he shot his estranged wife, the mother of his children, and then turns the gun on his children, is he places this phone call and he says, "I messed up." I mean, does that lead you to believe this was an impulsive act? What comes to mind when you hear about that bit of information?
Well, it sounds like an act of desperation. I mean, I don't know how he thinks he messed up because I don't know the backstory. I don't know, like I said, whether he was drinking in the house, whether he was fighting, whether he was aggressive, whether he was not, kind of investing adequate energy as a parent, whatever the issue is. There could be a million things which resulted in the breakup of a marriage. But it's interesting that he accepts or at least takes and feels some type of remorse or responsibility for having messed the situation up. So he's acknowledging that. But a lot of people mess up relationships and a lot of people screw up marriages, but they don't turn around and determine that the way to resolve this state of affairs is to do this sort of homicide suicide solution. So we obviously know that there's something far more fragile, far more defective about this guy than most people.
The thing that really shook me about it was the fact that he called the father, his father in law, the father of Cassandra, his estranged wife, and said, I messed up. And then apparently turns the gun on himself. The father in law comes home and finds all of this awful, this murderous scene. Her brother apparently was quoted as saying that, his father went out, never goes out. The first time he goes out in a long time, this happens, and he comes home and finds all of this after this phone call from Ruben. I mean, calling the father of your estranged wife to say I messed up and basically say what happened, is that bizarre to you?
Well, again, I think the issue here is desperation, impaired judgment, guilt, a sense of reaching out to someone perhaps that he respected and wanting to, if you will, make this last minute. I don't want to say it's a confession, but acknowledging that, as he said, that he messed up. That's a bit of an understatement. Messing up is something more superficial usually, like hitting a tree, backing out of your driveway. But from his perspective, based on his level of thinking, sophistication, he's letting someone he probably respected. You didn't notice he didn't disparage the wife. He didn't tell the father that his daughter was a terrible person, or he didn't use insults or disparage her in any way. He's just telling a guy who he probably had some respect for, look, like I really messed up, really
Mhm.
did something terrible.
This couple was together apparently, according to a friend of Cassandra, since they were 17 years old, and she described this feeling of disbelief that this was a quiet guy. Obviously, they were estranged, as you were saying, probably an act of desperation. We've heard in other cases, particularly in the Murdoch case in South Carolina, totally different type of circumstances, I believe, of this thing called a family annihilator. It's when somebody
Right.
has something bad going on in their lives, and that, whether it's financial stress or something like that. Does this fit the bill? Does this fit the criteria of a family annihilator? Because he takes out his family, but then he dies by suicide.
Yeah, I think it's slightly different. I don't think that he doesn't sound very sophisticated. It doesn't sound like he was attempting to commit this crime and then pretend that he wasn't there, or that, there were ulterior motives like financial, or there was some affair he was having and needed to dispose of an ex-wife or an estranged wife and family. I think his use of language strikes us as inadequate, but my guess is he was not a terribly verbal, thoughtful, or highly intellectual individual. I think he was a despairing individual. Usually, it takes a certain level of despair, hopelessness, to decide you're going to wipe out your family and then you're going to kill yourself. And in a sense, psychologically, what he's doing is he's reuniting with the family in the most perverse of ways. In other words, they all die together. So he wasn't looking for retribution, for example, punishment. He was looking to sort of die with his family. This is the last time uh, that they'd all be together. And he determined, based on his impairment, his, sort of disturbed thinking at the time, that this is the way to manage this. I'll just take all of us out and we'll leave the earth together as a family. So that was the best solution he could come up with in order to reconcile what was a loss that he couldn't tolerate.
You said that these murder suicides, and we do hear about these, it seems fairly frequently. We hear about these happening. Do you think they're happening more, or do we just hear more about it because we have more access to more news from across the country? We have a cell phone in our hands where we can get news alerts seems like every hour, if not more frequently than that.
Yeah, I don't know if it happens statistically more, but you're correct in saying that, when these events occur, everyone is appalled and shocked by it. And because of the access to social media, people can, you know, go online and talk about how horrible these events are. It becomes yet another example of one of these kind of terrible events. But they come with some regularity now. A long time ago, before you had cell phones and media was so well integrated, from state to state, country to country, I'm sure I know you had episodes like this happen all over the country, but it would remain sort of local, or maybe would be a blurb in some newspaper, you know, that was not in the locale. So, the home newspaper might have covered this.
Hmm.
But now, these kind of events take on sort of a national proportion because people have access to that information and that news. And sometimes really terrible, gruesome details, either visual or they have, neighbors or relatives who have walked in after the fact and can describe the carnage with terrible accuracy and in a frightening way. And we all have to admit that as terrible as these events are, the public has this taste to hear about these things. It's not like people say, we don't want to hear this. We don't want this advertised. People run to it. They want to hear about some terrible story.
And why is that?
I think it's that perverse side of human nature, that kind of voyeuristic. Let me hear about some terrible event. It's another terrible event. Maybe it's, thank God that's not me or my family. But look,
Hmm.
look at this other family. Look at how terrible some other people's lives are. Maybe some sick comparison being made between where you're at in your life, where some people are in their life.
Dr. N.G. Berrill, thank you so much for joining us today and offering your time and your expertise. We appreciate it, and we hope you'll come back sometime.
Sure, anytime. All right, you take care.
That's it for this edition of Law and Crime Sidebar Podcast. You can listen to and download Sidebar on Apple, Spotify, Google, and wherever else you get your podcasts. And of course, you can always watch it on Law and Crime's YouTube channel. Make sure you hit the subscribe button. I'm Angenette Levy, and we will see you next time.